Welcome, everybody, to another cast from the Traveller in the Evening, presented by me, once again, Andy Wilson. And today's guest, I'm very lucky to have with me Stuart Kendall. Now, I met Stuart when he did a presentation for the Blake Society a few weeks ago about Blake and Georges Bataille. And I have a great interest in Bataille. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Stuart did a tremendous presentation. I'll link to that in the page on Substack that goes with this podcast, so you'll be able to see Stuart's presentation for the Blake Society as well as part of the Substack page. But it opened up so many questions for me, so I invited Stuart onto the show. So Stuart is an independent scholar, I think the way to describe it, and specialising in Georges Bataille, late modernism and contemporary culture. And I want to say a few things about bibliography, because I didn't realise when I was listening to him speak at the Blake Society, you know, how much money he's made out of me and how many of his books I'd had without realising it, because a lot of his work has been as a translator. So there's a lot of Bataille I already had. I can't say I've read all of these books. I'm one of these people, as I'll explain shortly, that I have a real fixation on Bataille, and I buy books as they come out. You know, I must get back. There's quite a few collections I haven't fully read yet. And so I see that Stuart has translated a number of really key by Bataille. And again, Stuart will talk about that a bit in a while. But when I say key, I mean, when I think of Bataille, the books I bought when I was a student and shortly afterwards were things like Eroticism and the Tears of Eros and the Story of the Eye and things like that. And they were kind of core Bataille for me, but been a whole series of important work by Bataille translated into English for the first time since then. And many of Stuart's books have been amongst those, but we can talk about the details later. Second thing is Stuart's excellent book in the Critical Lives series, which I think is Reaction Book. His book for part of that series on Bataille. I've spent the last few days reading that, and just saying to Stuart, started recording, it's had quite an impact on me. I think it does begin to make Bataille much more of a character, as well as being appealing to me, but formed more of a coherent view of how his work develops and how the different phases of it are connected. So I very highly recommend that book. But I also want to say, and I realised I'd bought your book, that you've done a translation of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I read very, very recently, and I hadn't connected your name there as the translator with the Stuart that I was going to hear speak for the Blake Society in a few weeks' time. So I happened to have just read that recently, and again, I haven't got time here to go into details about that, but I will highly recommend it as a translation. Not that I have any expertise in the translation skills, but the impact of it. You can really see what you were getting at, especially given that what I thought was a really translator's introduction about the issues and about the rising. But I want to go on about that, but I'm not going to because we haven't got time. But that's also a tremendous. So that's sort of setting the scene as to who is Stuart. But before I call Stuart in, I want to say a little bit about my interest in the topic and the theme and where I'm trying to get to. And what that is that overwhelmingly my interest is in William Blake and writing about William Blake. But as I say on the Traveller in the Evening Substack, I very much connect that generally with themes to do with radical theology, radical politics. More specifically, I do connect it with surrealism. And in that connection, thought of, a couple of key figures that I have long had intuitions about that are connected with Blake, or whose work could throw light on Blake and vice versa. And two of those people are the two main characters have been Cornelius Castoriadis and Bataille. And now with Castoriadis, who people who listen in regularly will know, I interviewed the Castoriadis scholar Stephen Hastings recently. And with Castoriadis, there's a straightforward action, and that is the emphasis he places on imagination, as the unconstrained imagination. And he bases everything around that. And given that Blake talks about the imagination as the body of Christ, it's also, he's talking about the imagination in the same sense of creation ex nihilo. And in a world in which people imagine Blake to be essentially talking about, the need to be artistic when he talks about the imagination, I just think it's really important to understand that there are real implications of what Blake means by the imagination. And I think Castoriadis can help draw them out. Hence, we've talked about Castoriadis on this a couple of times. With Bataille, the situation is very, very different from my point of view. I've long had a powerful instinct that Bataille and Blake are, in some sense singing from the same hymn sheet, if that's not a wholly inappropriate suggestion. That they have some deep connection, but I've never been able to put my finger on it. And I've read the bits of Bataille that I know where he talks about Blake, an essay about Blake in his collection Literature and Evil, for example, and a few other things. But I wasn't aware of many of the things that Stuart talked about in his presentation to the Blake Society. So where I've ended up is that presentation to the Blake Society began to really open up some ideas about what my intuition, where my intuition might have been right or wrong or whatever, but some themes where I could begin to see there was crossover. It doesn't mean an identity of views or anything, but a powerful crossover and a connection between Blake and Bataille. So that's what I hope to end up digging into a bit later, with you, Stuart. But to begin with, I think that it would be really, really useful if you could say a little bit about Bataille in terms of positioning him as an intellectual, because many of my listeners might not know that much about Bataille. They came here for Blake thing. Some people will, obviously, but it'd be really useful if you could, for the general reader who's familiar with Blake, say something about Bataille character and his background. And I don't want to load too much onto this point, but enough of a description of Bataille to give most of my viewers an idea of who you're talking about when he talks about Blake.
Sure, absolutely. First of all, let me just say thank you for having me on. It's a great pleasure to talk about these things pretty much any time, but to share a conversation with it that can get into some depths and ask some questions is a greater pleasure. Now, in regard to Bataille, he's a very strange figure, Georges Bataille. He was born in 1897 and he died in 1962. And I talk about his work. I write about his work. I kind of go around and meet people interested in Bataille, and I find that people come to Bataille's work for many different reasons, and they each think of a very different kind of Georges Bataille. Bataille's a guy who wrote poetry and novels. He wrote kind of philosophical, theological, autobiographical meditations. He wrote books of what he thought of as political economy, but are kind of social, cultural theory. He wrote books of aesthetic criticism in the arts and literature, over a 40-year career of writing. So he spanned a great many different kinds of things. And then he also lived a very what do we want to say? A life that was filled with contradictions, I guess is one way to put it. A bit of an itinerant intellectual in certain ways. So what I'm suggesting there's a couple of things. On the one hand, he's famous as being a librarian. This is how he made his living. So quiet librarian by day. But he's also famous as a bit of a libertine. A man famous for his loves and his enjoyment of sensual pleasures and things like that, intoxication, this kind of stuff. So he has that sort of a contradiction. But within those two, very different parts of his life, he also passed through many different phases wherein he was engaged with the artistic avant-garde. Some of his closest friends were members of the Surrealist group in the 1920s. And then the political avant-garde in the 1930s, wherein he was part of the Democratic Communist Circle and published in their house organ, La Critique Sociale. So he was very much engaged in that Marxist adjacent or Marxist affiliated publication in the early 1930s. But by the late 1930s, he was doing something entirely different. He had founded the group Acéphale, as well as the College of Sociology, which are sort of two halves of an investigation of the problem of the sacred in society. And he thought of that investigation of the sacred in society as a a way to address political problems in that moment, the late 1930s, as the world was rushing into the conflict that would become World War II. So he's political. He's interested in religion. He's interested in art and literature. In World War II, he similarly, he moved away from this kind of direct political engagement, but he continued to think about the problems of politics. He sort of shifted his goals. In the immediate post-war period, he again tried to write in a very engaged political manner, though he was a dissident from kind of many groups. He founded the journal Critique, which is of course still being published as this kind of encyclopedia of thought. So in Critique, he was careful to have essays on literature, on philosophy, on the arts, but also on science, anthropology. So it's very much an encyclopedia of thought and this kind of wide-ranging thing. But then as the intractable political problems of the late 1940s drifted into the 1950s, Bataille really found himself without a home. He had close collaborative friends, and that's another thing we should emphasize about him, that Bataille's a great collaborator. He thinks in dialogue with other people, and so we can trace his life through his dialogues and his collaborations. But by the mid-1950s, he was in his 50s at this point, and he had already contracted the disease that would kill him by 1962. So he was a bit homeless and outside of the intellectual currents of his day, even though his work was at that point already being picked up as an extremely important influence on the next generation of French thinkers. So if Bataille's a guy who had famous battles in his times with André Breton in the 1920s, with Jean-Paul Sartre in the 1940s, those very conflicts are the things that would be part of the seedbed of his influence on the next generation of French thinkers, which is, of course, the post-structuralist generation of the 1960s. So people like Roland Barthes, but Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, Jean Baudrillard, Julia Kristeva, they all wrote under Bataille's direct influence. They tried to pick up the baton and run with it. And they each kind of ran in different directions, but that gives you, again, this sense of the kind of protein figure that Bataille really was. He was doing a great many things that don't immediately cohere when you look at the books on the shelf. It's like, how does this guy who wrote a book on Lascaux relate to this guy who was a political radical in the 1930s? It doesn't immediately cohere, though there are through lines, obviously, in his thought. But that's who Bataille is. I mean, he fascinates me because he brings so much of the major currents of early 20th century thought, psychoanalysis, philosophy, whether it's Hegel or Nietzsche, but literature, anthropology. He brings those currents to bear on his times. He engaged deeply with those times in all of its their richness and contradiction. And then he had this tremendous influence. So yeah, Bataille is a complicated thinker who has a complicated legacy, and that's why I keep talking about him.
When you say complicated, I mean, he ranges over so many areas that I think that if you're not prepared to dive in and make the connections and find out what they are, it will look like quite a sprawling output and hard to relate. And to some extent, that's deliberate. That's not an accidental output of his oeuvre, I think. You mentioned the various that he published in genres and across disciplines, and I think I find that very attractive in many intellectuals. That he really has that he's not bound by any particular discipline. His mind ranges like a philosopher's mind, not like a anthropologist or an aesthetician's or something like that. You forgot to mention that. You mentioned poetry, that he was a poet, and I forgot to say you have translated his poetry, which I had read at the translation. Yes. But also, obviously, pornography, and his book, The Story of the Eye, is don't know how to describe it, but I was going to say it's extremely pornographic, which it is, but that doesn't really give you anyone a good idea of what it's like. But it's an incredible book to me, and it's worth mentioning because it's very important to his oeuvre. And I do intend to illustrate our Substack piece with pictures from Hans Bellmer's illustrations to it, for example. So it's worth mentioning. But in terms of Blake and Bataille, I want to start with Bataille and the Surrealists, because in a way that I think it's okay for people to say this now, but I'm not sure how orthodox it is. I think of Bataille as one half of Surrealism, along with Breton and Bataille together as leg or whatever. In the way that it panned out historically, as far as I understand it, it was simply a matter that, Bataille knew, I think, originally Michel Leiris and André Masson anyway. So he was connected with some surrealists and became connected with more, but never tried to, join the surrealists, and was quite hostile to Breton, and apparently the feeling was mutual, and so on. But despite all of that, the reason I think of them as the two wings of surrealism is because methodologically and philosophically, at a very deep level, I do think they are the two alternatives, and I think Bataille understood that from an early stage, that his fundamental view was fundamentally at odds with Breton's Hegelianism and what he would have seen as a kind of idealizing rationalism. And I think I normally won't hear anybody say bad things about the surrealists, because in most contexts, anybody doing that is a bad person, or Breton, but within this context, I think Bataille has many excellent criticisms to make that are quite telling for the history of surrealism. So we can get into all that. But I wanted to say that openly, that's the sort of situation with Bataille and surrealism, which leads us on to the question of Blake, because, again, I have a powerful intuition that Blake is very important to surrealism in some way. The connection is important. But the surrealists kind of knew that. So Philippe Siffaut was one of the first people to translate Blake, and he wrote an early biography. And I quote it on my About page on Substack, because he says something like, Blake isn't an inspiration, he's a plateau to which you might rise. He's not an influence that you draw on as such. So there's a pretty high appraisal of Blake's significance. But then, having said that, then the surrealists don't seem to make much of that connection. And they also, to me, don't seem to really, they recognise important things in Blake, but I don't think they get him as a whole. And as I said to you at the Blake Society meeting, part of me suspects that. Now, let me again say this. Bataille understands Blake to be someone who understands evil and the other side of, good and religion and God and Jehovah, very much in the spirit of the marriage of heaven and hell, with its deliberate blurring of, good and evil, energy and reason, and all these kind of things. And I think that view draws out many interesting things in Blake, but it's hard to square with the fact that Blake was, in fact, a Christian. And although he wasn't churchy at all, he was very much, he would have seen himself as an Old Testament-style Christian, right? And as a number of people have said, although he was very hostile to the established churches, in some ways he was a very orthodox Christian thinker. So the surrealists were always going to have a relating to that, because, and again, the way I've put it to you is because of that sort of violent anti-clericalism of surrealism and the French avant-garde, certainly, generally. And, as a young man, when I first started reading about radical art, I was reading about the Dadists because I was influenced by electronic music and Cabaret Voltaire, the group, and Robin Gristle and things like this. And so I was reading about Dadaism, and I read about Arthur Cravan, who was British, I think, boxer who hung out with the Dadists. But he just used to punch priests in the street. He didn't get into an argument with them, he just laid them out. And I used to think this was absolutely tremendous, because I had some sense of, the kind of the radical critique of clericalism. But of course, it meant that the question of religion was like a loaded bomb for the surrealists, that they kind of handed off quickly from one to the other, like pass the parcel or something, because it was always going to go off. I mentioned this to you at the Blake Society, but I just want to give you the opportunity again to sort of respond to that. Perhaps in some general sense, I think you're likely to agree that the strength of their anti-clericalism is going to skew their view of various things. But I wondered to what extent you thought that might be true not only of surrealism generally, in some general sense, but specifically of Bataille, how you think, which is an invitation, I suppose, to tell us how you think he did absorb Blake and how he came to do that.
Yeah, I think these are two, there's sort of two stories to be told right there. I mean, first of all, there's the how did Bataille come to Blake story, and then there's also the why didn't the Surrealists come to Blake kind of a story. And I think that those two are related, and they tell us something that's one of the things that marks Bataille as being somewhat different than the Surrealists in terms of where he's going, what he's trying to do. So, I'm not sure which of those stories we want to tell first, but, I think in terms of this, just to stick with the Surrealists, maybe we'll go at this chronologically. Why didn't André Breton love William Blake? He seems like he should have loved William Blake. And since you asked me that question during the Blake Society, I've been thinking about it a bit. And first of all, I think your notion about the anti-clericalism of the Surrealists is of course, deeply true. They were famous for spitting on priests in the street, and this kind of stuff. So that sort of rebellious spirit, in terms of what they were trying to do, particularly in the 1920s, and the willingness to bring it into that sort of full violence. That's part of the Dada spirit. It's part of the willingness to take down all of the social institutions that had formed the civilization of which they were a part and which they rejected, right? So the anti-clericalism was one among many things that the Surrealists were using to sort of anchor their rebellious spirit. And that's all, I don't want to diminish their rebellious spirit by calling it something like that, because they were true rebels. This is a significant moment. So, all that is true and makes sense. And I think you're absolutely right. If you pick up a page of William Blake, you're liable to see, biblical cadence, biblical reference. The marriage of heaven and hell, just those terms themselves put us into a religious text that many of those Surrealists, Breton in particular, would have utterly rejected. So I think that there's that. And yet it's also, there's an ambivalence to it as well. So as you mentioned, Philippe Soupault, of course, is one of the earliest members of the Surrealist group. He and Breton wrote the magnetic fields together. And so Soupault is there at the beginning of Surrealism, but he also is the one who becomes, in that group, the earliest champion of Blake. Now, we should remember that Soupault is also one of the Surrealists who, famously discovered the poésie of Lautréamont, and brought kind of Lautréamont into the discussion with the Surrealists. And that there's this connection between Lautréamont and William Blake through the notion of evil and the prioritization of evil and the connection between evil and energy. And that's a theme that I'll probably keep coming back to again and again today. But that love of energy and evil that we get in Lautréamont and Blake, that we see in Philippe Soupault, that's the thing that I think brings Soupault to Blake. And I think that's what happens later with Bataille. But that's not something that André Breton is necessarily going to be motivated by or interested in. Breton is going to support, the radicalism of Lautréamont, but it's not a core focus of his interest. What really interests André Breton is the notion of, among other things, but in Breton's poetics, the most important thing for him is the notion of automatic writing and liberating the unconsciousness. So for Breton, this idea of the free-flowing, automatic, whether it's the dream image or what have you, anything that will allow him to have access to the unconscious is very important. Now, taking the notion of automatic writing as a foundation, and again, looking at a page of William Blake does not practice automatic writing. He practices inspired and visionary writing, and that is similar to, say, Rimbaud. And we could see how that could be related to a surrealist endeavor. But for Breton, Breton is the absolute defender and advocate for this automatic writing. And I'll also say that William Blake, as both a poet and an artist, again, sort of falls outside of Breton's interest. Breton Breton became interested in André Masson because he thought Masson's style could be affiliated with what he then thought of as automatic painting, right? He realized, Breton in 1924, realized that if surrealism is going to be a movement, it needs to have painters as well. It can't just be a literary movement. And so he started looking around for a way to expand the movement into the visual arts, and that expansion came first through this idea of the automatic image, the automatic drawing, and that's the André Masson connection. And the point I'm making is that is not William Blake. William Blake can give us, again, the visionary image, but it's not the automatic and free-flowing line. Obviously, Blake is one of the greatest artists in the history of English art, but it's not a surrealist kind of automatic line. So what I'm suggesting here is that André Breton had many reasons to overlook Blake, or to sort of dismiss Blake, most of which are related to, in my view anyway, to this kind of core intellectual interest in the liberation of the unconscious, which is, I think a strange notion, because when we think about Blake, or if you ask a Jungian what they think about Blake, they might think about where Blake's images and ideas come from, and they would point to the unconscious. So if Breton had maybe looked at it a little bit more closely, had a little more patience with it, then he might have developed an interest in Blake. But in that early moment, it was not there. And so there's a couple more things to say, I think, about this. Philippe Soupeau turns to Blake really in 1927, which is to say after his expulsion from the Surrealist group. So Soupeau's Blake is a post-Surrealist Blake for him. And that's, not to say that Soupeau didn't have friends in the wider Surrealist group. Soupeau is friends with, he was expelled from the Surrealist group on the same day as Antonin Artaud. They are friends with André Masson. So Artaud, Masson, Larice, Bataille, they're all hanging out at André Masson's studio, and it's in that circumstance that it's easy to imagine Philippe Soupeau bringing his copy of his new translations of these works by William Blake around. Soupeau, of course, is rejected from the Surrealist group for being too literary. That's the accusation. So not revolutionary enough. And of course, Antonin Artaud was expelled that same day because of his ideas about revolution. This is the moment when the Surrealists, when Breton's group of the Surrealists are trying to join the Communist Party and affiliate themselves with the machine of history in a new way. They were trying to expand their movement, and that turned out to be short-lived in that form. Breton would struggle throughout the 1930s and the 40s to find the proper affiliation for his revolutionary agendas. But, Soupeau was a casualty of that, just like Artaud was. And they found friends in André Masson's studio where they could explore different kinds of things. And André Masson has nice things to say about William Blake, about Blake the visionary, Blake the prophet of energy, these kinds of things that find their way into Bataille's engagement with Blake.
I think it's really important what you say about automatism, and it really defines Bretonian surrealism, right?
Absolutely.
There's also a sense in which you can say that it defines orthodoxism. That's mainstream surrealism, is automatism. And clearly it starts with Breton and Foucault, but Breton as someone who's trained, to treat mental patients and the war wounded and people with PTSD and so on. They find that the automatism will release the unconscious, release the contents of the unconscious. Well, having established that and made that the method, then the individual surrealists then go off and try and apply that insight with all kinds of different ways, different painting and plastic kind of automatism. I find that fascinating because it all hinges around the kind of original Freudian insight that if you silence the conscious mind, what you get is the unconscious. Now, that's a kind of, I don't say it's wrong, but it's a kind of Freudian prejudice. And what I mean by that is that I recently went to see the exhibition of works by Ethel Colquhoun, the British surrealist, who's famously a kind of a magical artist now and is celebrated as an important magical artist. So there's a debate about, was she ever really a surrealist, or can you be a surrealist and do magic, and permutations on this kind of dualism. But what it really hinges on is not so much what you think is in the unconscious, but what you think happens if you mute the conscious mind. If you mute, from Blake's point of view, if you mute yours and what comes through, and yes, it's the unconscious, but the unconscious itself could be channeling other things, and from Colquhoun's point of view, that could be other forces or land spirits or demons and angels and whatever it is. Yeah. What that means for me is that the emphasis on automatism can be detached from the Freudianism. Not that there's anything wrong with Freudian, I don't want to give that impression, but can be detached from it and just become a thing about what emerges when we mute, silence the rational mind. Now, the reason I say all that at some length is not because I think you won't know it, but because I was very struck in your Critical Lives book when you were recounting, I suppose, Bataille's development. For example, you describe the creation of the story of the eye. And what happens for those who haven't read it, you're not going to believe what I'm about to say, but it's a pornographic story involving, an eye, an egg, and all these things are inserted into vaginas and removed. But the methodology behind it is deeply pornographic. But as you say, it moves at the surface of words and meaning. So the egg and the eye are related because they look similar. Someone pointed this out to Bataille, and this becomes then a principle of how he develops the text. Yeah. A urine stain in a circle then becomes a third member of this series. The sun is a fourth member. There's nothing automatist about that. It's quite methodical, but it has this very similar effect of shaking up reason once it's done. So Ethel Colquhoun talked about mantic stains, and the stains were the things that were produced at random, the automatism, and then they became clues to prophecy. In Bataille, his method produces what I think are surrealist visions, pornographic surrealist visions, but not using automatism. But there's something about the result that puts it in the similar space to what is liberated by automatism, but it's generated by almost a complete opposite approach. It remains mantic, but the stains aren't random. They're produced by this method of his, which I say a weird method, but it is obviously deeply intended as an attack on idealism. So it's not just that it's a way of avoiding a kind of idealism and a rationalism just as much as automatism is what I'm trying to say. That's why, for me, although automatism defines orthodox surrealism, Bataille represents a philosophically coherent criticism of Breton's rationalism, if you like, and idealism, but it leads him into an artistic space that is similar. The aesthetics are surrealist aesthetics or part of that. Sorry to have gone a long-winded thing, but I just want to explain how I can agree with you that he's coming from a very different place and say that automatism is mainstream and orthodox surrealism, but still see Bataille as absolutely, within that circle. A couple of other sort of minor things. One is I'd never read Breton on Masson, but that really surprises me what you say, because Masson to me, perhaps because I've seen him so many times in conjunction with Bataille, but nevertheless, he seems ultimately a very, very, there's an element of spontaneity, but he's always channeling a nature of some kind of thing, and the imagery is always deeply Bataillean to me. I'm a very syncretic in the way I kind of think about these things, so I find it quite easy to assimilate Bataille to Breton, even though they're completely different. But in a similar way, talking about the automatism versus however you would describe Bataille's method story of the I, whether or not the unconscious lies behind this, or if they'll call Hoon's spirits or whatever, or, another thing that they all have in common is that they're not the rational mind in the sense that they are, what am I going to say? Is that another alternative as well as spirits and the unconscious in this methodology is that what is emerging is the imagination. And I find that a really powerful connection, a way of plugging Blake into the argument. So there's a bit in Bataille where he talks, I think in the essay in Literature and Evil on Blake, where he talks about poetry and the poetic genius, using Blake's term, represents the breakdown of again, he doesn't say Eurozenic, but Blake would have said Eurozenic reason, and that's what he's attacking. Not only that's what Bataille is attacking in his method, in his work, but that's the key to how he attacks, in a sense, to blowing it away, to release the imagination, whether that's through that method in the story of the I, or whether someone else is doing it through automatism, is to release the imagination. So that, to me, that creates a vocabulary for translating between Bataille, Breton, Surrealism, and Blake. If you see the symmetry between those things as all being the other side of the Eurozenic reason.
I mean, you've thrown a lot here into this conversation. So, like to kind of gather all these threads and say some things about them. Like we've got a lot of balls in the air right now, and I do feel like what we should do is back up a little bit to help understand a little bit of how these figures got to where they are and how we can see them that way. And so, so one thing to say about it is, as you're suggesting, Bataille's method in the story of I works across the surface of language, and it is quite an erotic text, not just in terms of what's described, but in terms of how it functions, that things become other things, that words become other words, that it's a book that's almost impossible to read in translation. At least in the English translation, because the words in French do things to one another and with one another. Their proximities suggest the new words. And so Bataille's method in that book, and we should specify that book is very much set apart within his oeuvre, right? He doesn't use that method very often. He has written he wrote several other novels, or longer prose pieces, which work in completely different ways. Some are much more traditional, others use symbols in different ways. They're complicated at the level of language and idea, and again, kind of quite extraordinary in terms of like the range of experimentalism that we have in Bataille's prose styles. I marvel at it, but nevertheless, these things stand a bit apart. Now, that style that he has in Story of the I is something that we could see in somebody like Raymond Roussel, right? So Raymond Roussel, who is not a surrealist, though celebrated by surrealists, and of course celebrated by Michel Foucault, who knew him. Roussel constructed his books in a similar manner to Story of the I, right? It's language unfolding a thing. But as you say, it offers these ways around and ways to explore similar problems. And so we should say that Bataille's relationship with surrealism is obviously extremely complicated. He was the greatest of lifelong friends with several people who were, committed card-carrying surrealists. He contributed to the, La Révolution Surrealiste, at least in a very, very small way. But he did have a personal antipathy to André Breton that was shared. And then Breton attacked him famously in the Second Surrealist Manifesto as being an obsessive for his interest in radical materialism. Bataille is a much more radical materialism, and Breton, in comparison, looks like an idealist. So this can only be greeted with hostility from André Breton, who is attempting to be inspired by Hegel, whereas Bataille is attempting to critique Hegel. So they travel in the same circles. They attempt reconciliation in the mid-1930s in a group called Counterattack. in which they are both interested in the power of myth in politics. This is during the 1930s when Breton was trying to expand surrealism to include reference to the magical and the symbolic. And these are, of course, very important to Bataille as well. So they both understood the power of myth and religion and the occult, in terms of communal formation, social activation, this kind of stuff. And it is again in that kind of a space that Bataille is going to turn to William Blake, which I'll get to in a minute. But in that moment, we can also see this kind of reconciliation of goals. Bataille and Breton have another falling out in the mid-1930s, but after World War II, after Sartre has attacked Bataille, very intensely, Breton makes some overtures, and Bataille begins writing about surrealism, often in review articles for Critique, in a much more, let's say, laudatory and conciliatory way. And in the last 15 years or so of his life, Bataille describes himself as, surrealism's enemy within. So he's somebody who he didn't join the group, but he's part of its overall, let's say, social imaginary, just to bring that notion back into it. The goals of surrealism are something that Bataille shares. So I use the phrase impossible surrealism to describe what Bataille is interested in. And by that I mean that for Bataille, there's this quest for the utterly unknown. He wants the widest possible frame of inclusivity for thought. And that includes the things that are outside of rational knowledge, just to bring things back to what we were talking about. Forces that are outside of what we can know, forces outside of the scripted and the servile, or servile rather, the things that can't be employed. This is the key thought or the key element of Bataille's thought, is this notion that things can't be productively used and that they slip out of utility. And that's what brings him into dialogue with the surrealists. Breton, particularly in the mid-1930s, after he had read Heraclitus, has this sort of similarly expansive view of trying to bring everything kind of together and bind it all, have a unified vision of the world. Now, Bataille's unity is a unity that still excludes things, in which things don't quite cohere, in which the contradictions are not smoothed out into a satisfying synthesis. Now, André Breton, closer to Hegel, is going to seek that satisfying synthesis, whereas Bataille is ultimately seeking ways to understand that things don't cohere, that it can't all be gathered together. And that's where this notion of the possible and the impossible come in. For Bataille, it's, I think, impossible surrealism because it's a incoherence. And that fits in with his ideas about the things that bring him to William Blake. So maybe I should go back and say, and chart the relationship between Bataille and Blake. As we were saying, Bataille would have been familiar with Blake, whether it's through the Foucault collection or something like that. Bataille worked at the Bibliothèque Nationale, where there was a show of Blake's work in 1937. Bataille actually came to reading William Blake in October of 1936, when his lover, Colette Pénaud, finally left her previous partner, Boris Souveraine, and moved into his house. Colette Pénaud, known as Laure, had read William Blake in Madrid in April or May of 1936. She moves in with Bataille, and days later, he goes and checks out The Marriage of Heaven and Hell from the Bibliothèque Nationale. I mean, what an act of love that is to me. To me, it's an utterly beautiful story. But that's the moment when he is part of Acéphale. It's as the College of Sociology is being founded. It's as Bataille is looking for myth and religion as ways to expand his political understanding of community and how it's formed. And so William Blake and his appeal to the sacred, his appeal to the idea, the question of what is God and how does God work in the human imagination. this is Bataille, the moment when Bataille is also, for the first time, really deeply reading Nietzsche. And he reads Kierkegaard at this same moment. He's been taking Alexandre Kojève's class on Hegel, but again, with this kind of, Hegel ultimately becomes the great enemy, and the enemy who is correct and whose work we have to undermine. But nevertheless, this person whose logic is irreproachable, irrefutable. So Blake enters into that conversation for Bataille in that way, inspired by love and the search for the sacred, the sacred experience. So it's a very, I think, beautiful and interesting moment. And as you were saying, so Bataille, after the war, Bataille engaged with Blake in different ways. He wrote 2 reviewer articles, one of which is this kind of expanded version of which is in his book, Literature and Evil. For years, he worked on some translations of Blake's work and thought of producing a separate volume with a long introduction, something like the Foucault translations from earlier. And this would have been a much more sort of Bataille Blake. But I think even more telling, if you read Bataille's works, you see quotations from Blake and references to Blake pretty much everywhere. In all of Bataille's most important books, there's some either epigram or quotation or something. Blake is there as a companion of thought for Bataille, just like Nietzsche. And he's a figure whose vocabulary enters into Bataille's in absolutely crucial ways. So words like energy, or more importantly, even exuberance, become key words for Bataille. And so, in other writings where Bataille is using words like energy.
Can I interrupt and ask you a question, which is that...
Yeah, absolutely.
I hadn't worked out in the sort of historical sequence of things where Bataille's coming to Blake or finding Blake fits in with his development of his ideas of expenditure, and which you're talking about when you say exuberance. So we're talking about, he has these... So for the listeners, Bataille has a whole theory, economics of not production, but consumption. And he makes exuberance and the gift and, basically wasting resources from a production point of view as the essence of things. And that becomes a really central ideas for him. But just when you were talking about exuberance, I made the connection. But what I want to ask you, in what order did those things emerge? Did he sort of read the Blake and then begin thinking more about it's Mauss, isn't it? The anthropologist and his ideas of, potlatch economies and things like that. But did he go from Blake to that, or did he recognise that Blake ideas about exuberance and energy and excess were commensurate with these emerging ideas of expenditure and consumption?
Well, that's a good question. So Bataille's writing about expenditure begins, and really his sort of mature work begins in 1927. So he's 30 years old. And he has this kind of vision of what the world is and how it works. And that is to say that the world is this place of kind of roiling excess, this overflowing exuberance of the world. But he doesn't have any vocabulary to talk about this. And so in his writings from the late 1920s, many of which, the most far-reaching ones of which, are unpublished during his lifetime, right? He's searching for a way to talk about this I'm calling it vision of the world, this understanding, and a way to kind of frame it that's going to work for other folks and make some sense and do the most good, let's say. And so he first offers, he writes The Solar Anus in 1927, and that has some of these things, but a lot of these keywords are absent from that. Then in the early he formulates these notions of base matter, the formless, things like that are crucial to his thought, but don't have this sort of fullness. I mean, it's there in terms of this overwhelming excess of the overflowing quality of the world, but it doesn't enter into the wider frame. In the early 1930s, he writes his essay, The Notion of Expenditure, and his other essay, Sacrifices, which are both related to this on sort of two sides. Sacrifices about individual experience, notion of expenditures about social formation. And there too, it's like he's trying to figure out how to say this. When he published the book, The Accursed Share, in 1949, he said it had taken him 18 years to write it. And what does that mean? That means that he wrote drafts and essays, and he tried to formulate these thoughts and tried to find a vocabulary and a way to talk about it throughout the 1930s, from 1949 to 18 years before that is 1931, when we have the first drafts of the notion of expenditure. So he was searching for this vocabulary, this way to frame it. And if you read some of his essays from the late 1930s, like Celestial Bodies, for example, you see him trying to formulate this vision of the world. How do we explain, I'll call it the peregrinations, the motions of energy through the world? How does this solar radiance travel through the plants and animals into our bodies, into our own exuberance? He's looking for a way to talk about it and the different parts of it. He tries to collaborate with a guy named Georges Ambrosino, who is a physicist and a friend of his, and member of Acéphale. He wanted Ambrosino to help him write the scientific side of the book, and this happens in the late 1940s. The mid to late 1940s. He hopes that The Accursed Share can have chapters on biology and physics, the sort of chemistry of expenditure. But ultimately, Ambrosino's busy studying, atomic bombs. He can't collaborate with Bataille on this project. So Bataille writes I'll call it the cultural side of the book, which is this historical data about the way that Aztecs and Northwest Coast Indians and or Native Americans and in Islam and Tibetan Buddhism, just the way that different cultures frame expenditure. But at this point, by that time, he has been reading Blake for 10 years. And so the Accursed Share has an epigram, exuberance is beauty,
yes,
from the Proverbs of Hell. And it has a key example about a tiger, The book is shot through with Blake and Blakean vocabulary at that point. And so I'm not arguing that it's the key to understand, Blake is the key to understanding Bataille, but I am arguing that Bataille loved Blake because of this way of seeing the world, this notion of excess and exuberance, all of those things, even, the formulation of eternal delight. That sort of the joyousness of the exuberant world. That's actually a phrase that Bataille uses. So he takes on this Blakean vocabulary that is almost impossible not to see, if you're me, and keyed to that kind of stuff. So the Blakean vocabulary helped him. It reaffirmed, I think, the central intuition that drove his intellectual career, if that makes sense.
Makes me think of quite a few things. One, I meant to show you this earlier, and our listeners, obviously, by definition, will not get to see it. But this is the sports shirt of my old high-tech boutique programming company that did key work in Silicon Valley. But anyway, this is our sports shirt, which I thought I'd show you. And what I used the Acéphale image by Masson, which I'm going to say a little bit more about for our listeners. But anyway, as our kind of our logo when we did sports and our high-tech company. I mention it because you've mentioned Acéphale a couple of times. I thought I'd better say something to listeners who don't know about it. Acéphale was a sort of secret society that Bataille set up. But he did it after he'd been trying to work in probably the most intense way he ever did with the other surrealists, with Breton, in a group that he founded called Counterattack. And I want to mention that because I think it's really important to understand part of his connection with Blake is that what Counterattack was about. Now the surrealist political activity, I find it tremendously inspiring that they took the politics seriously, that surrealism wasn't just an art movement, but an attempt to change the world. And it is reasonable in their time that they started by aligning themselves with Bolshevism and Lenin and the Russian Revolution. it is astounding how few of them didn't get absorbed into it. I know some of them did. Aragon and other people became Stalinists. Even Tristan, I think, did. Zara did.
Right.
But I think it's amazing that Breton and many of the others stood out against that, became Trotskyists and so on. But the counterattack business, Bataille's attempt to come up with a way of countering fascism without having any illusions in the Communist Party. Okay, and I think it's obviously a radical position. It's way to the left Communist Party. What I mean is, it's amazing that he could achieve that insight at that time, that to see the limitations of the Communist Party. But the key thing about that is that Bataille's insight was that fascism was successfully mobilizing the masses through the use of myth. And he wanted to counter a different myth to that. And this is very, very unlike orthodox Marxism, which is rationalist from top to bottom. I'm amazed he could even get Breton on board with the idea of talking about it, because it is so rationalist. But the idea that we would mobilize myth is something I've always believed as an anti-fascist. It's what the left don't do. But I wanted to say that out loud because that makes a connection with Blake more obvious. Blake is obviously all about myth that he develops. And, are they politically mobilizing myths? I hope so. But I wanted to say that to explain to our listeners that what Acéphale was. Acéphale emerged when the counterattack broke down, but I wanted to pursue that perspective of using myth to mobilize the masses against fascism by creating his secret society, which was in pursuit of that ideal, developing this myth. So that's kind of contextual for our listeners. But one thing I wanted to say, which is a different topic but connected, was when you describe Bataille's method, his resistance to idealism, his not wanting to have the sublation, not wanting everything to fit back together at the end of the day. Actually, I once saw a crime film about these teddy boys who got successfully prosecuted for murder because at the end of the trial they added up all the money and they'd spent 2 shillings more than they should have, so they must have done the robbery. Bataille never counted the pennies at the end of the kind of exchange. He was looking at something else. But the reason I mention that is because I suspect that he intuited a similar mentality in Blake, and that is very unusual because most commentators on Blake don't recognize that. They see Blake as developing a myth, which is like a theory. The zones represent aspects of the personality, and then hey ho, the secret is all about balancing these forces. It's all like fluid mechanics, something. Everything has to balance and everything adds up. Or I think there's a very powerful case that hasn't been made very well yet by anybody, that Blake deliberately deals in a sort of chaos, a kind of overdetermination, underdetermination. I noticed looking at Masson's paintings, for example, and then Belmer's illustrations to the story of the eye, how often they're kind of maximalist. They fill up the whole page with the same kind of energy that Blake's tendrils and vines do. Sorry, I should show you my tattoos to these Blake tendrils and vines spilling out everywhere. And I think Blake uses, as I say, underdetermination, overdetermination. He uses images that conflict with the text. He uses many different ways to basically queer up the whole, to prevent the development of a simple story. It's a myth, but it's a myth that's moving and developing and can't be captured rationalistically. And I want to mention, I wrote about this on my blog in an essay about Blake's illustrations to the Book of Job, and how if you read Job, there's these powerful subterranean currents of Canaanite mythology to do with the conquering of chaos and Yahweh's feat of chaos to make a world. And my argument is that Blake lets some of the chaos slip back in. And my thinking about this is that when I was reading you talking about Bataille's method, I got the similar sense of, the reason he differs, the reason not everything adds up, the reason it isn't a logical series is precisely in order to prevent the reader arriving at an idealist conclusion too early or ever, if you see what I mean. So all I'm trying to say is that I think there are elements to Blake's method that very directly mirror some aspects of Bataille's, but it isn't much commented on because people don't see that much in Blake, and it hasn't been a big feature of Blake commentary, which is all about, Jungians talking about forces, or this guy Ian McGilchrist talking about bilateral brains, left and right brain, and how you have to balance them. all this kind of nonsense. Blake is doing something much more powerful and harnessing elements of chaos, I think, in a productive, deliberate way in order to forestall sort of ideological closure. And that reminded me very much of Bataille, and I won't to say that because I don't think that would occur to most, because that's not the image we have of Blake.
I completely agree with you. There's also something that's counterintuitive, and not merely counterintuitive, but almost anti-intuitive. You know, when we're reading a page of something like Jerusalem or Milton, you know, it's one of the Blake's later great epics, our habit as a reader, and not just habit, like the nature of reading, is to look for meaning. We want to figure out how these things are related. We want to follow the story, and we want to follow the forces. Now, in his essay about Blake, Bataille says that's all nonsense. That we can follow that and we should follow it, but to try to turn it into, as you were suggesting, some sort of rational narrative to explain Blake just gives us a bunch of explanations. You know, we don't want explanations. We want the very, very vigorous force of the language unfolding. You know, and this is, I don't know why this example is coming to me, but, you know, it's like the beauty of a tree. You know, if we can explain it as science, we can have all the reasons for a tree being a tree, but those reasons are nothing. What matters is the tree and the way that it unfolds, and, you know, the energy with which it does what it does. So Blake's writing is that very, I'll use the word muscular, unfolding. You know, it's these divisions and bifurcations, these tensions that don't quite neatly resolve, wherein a thing becomes another thing, sort of in that Bataillean way, and we can explore the relationship between those, say, two things. But to reduce Blake to a sort of mechanistic explanation of his mythology or symbol system really does a disservice to Blake as a writer, and it reduces the joy. And this is a problem, because, as I'm saying, part of our habit in reading is to explain things. But the minute we explain things, we have missed the very point of the gesture. And if we fail to explain things, then we're certainly not going to get our PhD, right? You know, and I think that a lot of the readers of Blake, you know, Blake is this weird figure, in sort of the recuperation of Blake. We have a lot of, myriad copies of the Songs of Innocence and Experience, or even Marriage of Heaven and Hell, but almost no way to access Milton or Jerusalem, other than if we, obtain the collected works of William Blake. We have to have a giant tome in our hands, and we have to really get into it if we're going to get into something like that. There's not a let's call it an affordable edition of those, those later, more challenging works. We can't just pull them off the shelf and enjoy the unfolding of the language, and it feels very counterintuitive. But then the people who do, they are professors. They become English professors.
But it amazes me how much stories that the professors extract and how the analysis becomes common sense. So I was looking at the history of the reception of Jerusalem, the preface to Milton, the bit thing that becomes the hymn. And it took a long time before anyone heard it or read it in the way that we do now. It took a lot of people working on it. And what I'm trying to say is that there's much more there in the poems than we're allowed to see normally. And I think that's, because there's so much more going on. But I wanted to mention before we finish this, a couple of things. One of them is that a story you tell, which I assume is a pretty canonical story about Bataille, because it's so striking, is that when again, for the listeners, Bataille's father went insane with syphilis, and he was blind and totally incapacitated, and this had a huge effect on the young Bataille, which is extremely formative. But there's a story you tell about how when the doctor is visiting father, the doctor pops out to speak in confidence to his mother in the next room. And when he goes out or whatever, Bataille's dad, in the midst of his insanity, shouts out, yells out, but don't think I don't know that you're fucking my wife. But the really interesting thing is that Bataille says something along the lines that I decided then that I wanted in every single situation I could be in to work out what was the equivalent of the effect of that phrase. And of course, the effect of that phrase is to break up the whole situation and all the semantics and all the expectations and all the social imaginary and all the roles. He sort of exploded it. with something obscene. And I see and I think that's what Bataille does do. I think that is a kind of, that sense is really motivating for him. But there's an unlikely connection again with the Blake thing about not, avoiding the neat, glib answer, exploding, I don't know, the labyrinth where we are at the moment in it, exploding the walls of it, not allowing reason to continue going. What Blake would have said, Newton's starry wheels, the wheels of reason turning and turning and turning, but nothing is getting achieved. So I thought that even in that extreme expression of his father's, and Bataille's take on it expressed this similar materialist. I noticed you say in your Gilgamesh book that Blake was a visionary materialist, and I don't think he was a materialist, but I do think he was a monist, right? I think we have that in common, and I don't think much beyond that matters. But it's weird how this religious Christian monist, his method very much sounded like Bataille's father. He didn't do it in the same way, but blowing up the continuity of the rational and all the rest of it as central to the method. I just wanted to, it's a bit technical actually, and you might not want to say anything about it, but I feel we have to, because you mentioned dialectics and the importance of the critique of Hegel, but the importance of dialectics itself and your formal critique of it. And you said something in your Blake Society talk about how Bataille was taken with Blake dialectics, and I didn't know if you meant that in a sort of broad sense of, with the cut of his jib sort of thing, or in the specific sense of what Blake contraries and negations, because I possibly don't even understand. I've read it many times, that I think it's in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell about contraries and negations. And I'm not sure I understand it, because wherever I see it deployed by Blakean commentators, it's along the lines that everything requires its opposite. So you're allowed to oppose things as long as you don't negate and kill them. And it just sounds like this absurd kind of weak-kneed, liberal, middle of the road sort of, and that's the only interpretation I ever hear of Blake's formal dialectics about contraries and negations. Did you have any thoughts at all about, or rather, did Bataille have any thoughts at all about that, in the sense of reading that particular bit of Blake and seeing that as a commentary on dialect?
Yes. So part of the point I was working on in the Blake Society lecture, and kind of on this point, is that I think that William Blake became very important to a certain group of philosophers and critics in France in the 1940s. And so this is the group of folks that are associated with Bataille, but also expanding kind of beyond him. Partly for this reason, that Blake offers a way of thinking about contraries and opposition that is non-synthetic, right? That is not purely Hegelian. And there are, of course, many other ways to sort of think about this problem, but that debate and that way of thinking about it has, it had other implications that are important at that time. So as we were saying a few minutes ago, Bataille comes to Blake in 1937 at that same moment when he's looking for alternatives to Marxism. And that's to say, he's looking for alternatives to Hegelian dialectical thinking. And he's not alone in that. Now, that problem is one kind of problem when it's 1937 and your questions are Stalin and Hitler. But it becomes a different kind of problem, in 1943, and again in 1946. So when Bataille turns to Blake in the immediate post-war period, or he continues to read Blake in that post-war period, that same sort of debate is there. Now, the fascist threat is not there, though of course it has returned. The communist, let's say, problem is still there. So reading Blake and thinking about the problems of contraries is very important in the immediate post-war period, because it's a way of thinking about philosophy. And what do we want to say here? I'll say that, the philosophies of life, existentialism. It offers a way of thinking about existence and the quest for meaning in human life that is outside the frame of Hegel and Marxism. So at that moment, France is looking for its path politically. Philosophically, you have a bunch of Hegelians, and these include folks like Jean-Paul Sartre, right? Sartre is a Hegelian Cartesian existentialist. Now, Bataille and his group, group of friends, collaborators, they are looking for alternatives to that. So even though Bataille is close friends with Alexandre Kojève, and Kojève is inspired by Heidegger, and so this is a more complicated story than I'm making it sound. But Bataille basically gravitates towards a guy named Jean Wahl, who is an interpreter of Kierkegaard, and of course Bataille's friend Maurice Blanchot also is associated with the same sort of gesture. And what I'm arguing is that this appeal towards a kind of Kierkegaardian, Nietzschean, Blakean alternative to the thought of contraries is a way of undoing Hegel. It's an alternate path that they are attempting to chart in their post-war writings. Now, there's not enough Blake available in translation and known. Bataille's reading Blake in English at this point. There are some translations of a few of the prophetic books, but it's really not, let's say, as available as possible. However, what I'm suggesting here is that somebody like Jean Wahl can write about Kierkegaard, and he's of course the foremost interpreter of Kierkegaard in France at the time. He can write about Kierkegaard, he can write about Blake, which he did. And he can use some of these same ideas from sort of both figures in this attempt to think about contraries that don't end up with a satisfying Hegelian synthesis. So what are some of the alternatives? Blake also talks about contraries in the preface to Part 2 of Milton. So, and that's where he says that contraries can both be true. Now, somebody else says that contraries can both be true, and that's Empedocles and his 20th century psychoanalytic follower, Sigmund Freud. For Freud, contraries can both be true, and we can have Eros and Thanatos, and there can be eternal strife between them. And this can be the tension in our mind. And, Bataille is navigating between all of these different ways of thinking about integration, sublation, sublimation, all the way that these things fold into one another. Ultimately, where Bataille ends is with a tragic mode of thought in which the excess of life pours out and is lost, and there's a residual element of waste in all experience. And that's the nature of his thought about the accursed share and consumption in culture. We are tragic beings. We will expend, we will lose. We will try to not lose everything because we want to maintain our lives. But there is this battle that Freud would call this battle between Eros and Thanatos. And, Bataille spends a lot more time thinking about Thanatos and expenditure. But, he would use words from Blake. Exuberance, energy, and delight to talk about that, but in a Nietzschean tragic frame.
As a complete aside, when Blake talks about both countries being true, I think he says, as in Beulah, which he often treats as a state of sleep, which is a nice overlap with Freud there, with the countries both being true, or at least in dreams, I have a sort of final question for you, which is about the reception of Bataille, okay? Because to me, my basic assumption, for example, regarding Blake, completely misunderstood today, despite his huge popularity through, the kind of Communist Party historians who tied him to the ranters and the diggers and the left wing of the English Civil War, the countercultures Blake, Dylan and Ginsberg and all this kind of thing. I think all of that, in terms of the reception of Blake, has completely gone away, and now it's all Jungians and I don't know, it's a really dreadful sort of reactionary general mood in the world of Blake, I find, despite the fact some academics are doing very, very interesting work on Blake, but the reception generally doesn't reflect. And I wanted to finish with a question about the reception of Bataille, which you may or may not even really want to comment on, but it was kind of, I think I said to you before we started recording at least, that I found your book in the Critical Lives series really, really powerfully useful to me in beginning to connect the different bits of Bataille together, which has been a problem because if you weren't paying a lot of attention, then you'll have seen that Bataille's work has rolled out in English translation over quite a long period of time it does cover everything from, the pornography of Story of the Eye, say, or that particular pornography, to his comments on the Accursed Share and, exuberance, to eroticism, the tears of Eros, evil. Connecting it all together is hard when you're talking about someone who's not in a position to write theses on Feuerbach, because he's against that. He doesn't want to write theses on Feuerbach. So, but one aspect of the kind of reception of Bataille that I've noticed is a kind of very simple, Bataille is for evil. It's a very simple kind of Church of Satan kind of inversion of our values, and Bataille is sometimes identified with that, which worries me because I think he has such an enormous amount to contribute to our understanding of how we could build a modern myth in a Blake, in sense, apply imagination to politics at a time when, as you say, the fascist threat is returning, which puts all these questions right back on the agenda. Will the reason of the Corbynites and the democratic left be suffice to stop fascism, or do we need to build a new myth? We do. And I think Bataille can really help with that. But the last time I saw anyone talk about Bataille before listening to your talk at the Blake Society last week was an ex-friend of mine who had been a leftist intellectual, but has now become a fascist. And she was lecturing on Bataille. And it was all just, the whole lecture was full of kind of right-wing kids all sniggering about, human sacrifices around Acéphale. There's all this sort of snickering, that kind of image of Bataille, which is a kind of... So this must seem like such a strange question, but I once ran a blog about countercultural fascism. Okay, a lot of it was about the kind of industrial music and the post-industrial scene and its way of absorbing fascist-like Evola. And they are also keen on Bataille. So in the same way that I have this view of the long-term development of Blake studies, which is a parlous state, in my opinion, or Blake reception, as a result. How do you think about Bataille reception, given that I think it's quite a contested field, that he's much misunderstood and is likely to be for a long time, notwithstanding your efforts, Stuart?
I began by saying that Bataille appeals to a very wide range of readers for a very wide range of reasons. And I think that is, it's sort of the good and the bad with that. Whatever the gateway is, the garden is on the other side. So I think I guess I approach that stuff with a bit of tolerance, though on the other hand, it's extremely disappointing and also surprising. Now, yes, it is absolutely true. Bataille in Acéphale was interested in creating community ultimately through human sacrifice. He, at a certain point in October of 1939, asked the other remaining members to kill him as a sacrifice, and they did not. And there's a lot more to say about that, and it's probably not a good ending. But Bataille is somebody who was willing to engage with that kind of stuff. He put his life literally on the line. But then he also he writes about sexuality and transgression. And his understanding of that is extremely nuanced and subtle and developed over a long period of time, and deeply informed, obviously, by anthropology and psychoanalysis and philosophy and all this kind of stuff. But just merely writing about eroticism and that sort of titillation, and that there's this pornographic component to his. But let's just say it attracts the casual reader, very much so. But what Bataille says ultimately about transgression in his book Eroticism is that transgression upholds the law, that there are periods of release and restraint, or of license and restraint. And this is how culture works, that we need both the sort of the rational, organized side of our day, but we also need the festival at the end of our week or at the end of our season. And so what Bataille is ultimately interested in is finding out how do you organize those periods of license and restraint, and how do we motivate them, and how do we organize them? And so that is to say that transgression upholds the law, not necessarily this law, because this law might be a law that is designed just to make kleptocrats ever more wealthy.
So what you're saying just reminds me so much of a conversation we had on the podcast some time ago, the Castoriadis, about the imagination and the instituted imagination, how they're kind of what you need the one to modify the other. The instituted imagination it can be the enemy, it can be the state that you're fighting. But you're trying to mobilize the imagination against the imagination, and I see it as very analogous to what you're saying. I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that's
absolutely. That's very much the case. To say that we're going to just use transgression to throw out all law is not what Bataille is saying. He's saying that we need to figure out what the right form of restraint might be, and this is why I spend a lot of time talking about Bataille and, let's say, sustainability, or, Bataille and design. Bataille's a guy who's interested in our pleasures, but not endless pleasure. That we need to have periods of license and restraint. We need to have an organization for our waste. So all of this makes sense. When I, read that line, though, in eroticism, about transgression upholding the law, I think about William Blake. I think about excess. I think about how we'll never know, how much enough is unless we know how much too much is. And, that is part of the appeal of Blake for Bataille. And yeah, so there are people who misread Bataille. I've been approached by a number of anarchist groups that love Bataille, and there's a kernel of that which is there, but on the other hand, that is not what Bataille is not speaking of complete and utter anarchy. He is not talking about murdering your neighbors. He's talking about the appropriate use of pleasure, and of course that phrase brings up Michel Foucault, and Foucault takes that entire way of thinking about the use of pleasure and the care of the self from Bataille. That way of thinking about the organization of experience in our lives. And that's to say also the organization of imagination, what Bataille would call the poetic, or Blake would call the poetic genius. All that is very much a part of what Bataille is doing. But yeah, at this point we have all of Bataille's major works in English translations. Some of them have been I've done new translations of works that have been previously translated, as well as many others. I've translated 7 books by Bataille at this point. And there are a few others that I would love to be able to do, but getting copyright and getting the publishers to line up, all those challenges. So I would say that now is a good time to be reading Bataille, and a lot of people seem to be interested in his work because I think it does touch upon many crucial problems that we are definitely still facing. He's a crucial reference for us moving forward. So, on the whole, I'm hopeful about, the future of Bataille reception. I'll even say possibly even more hopeful than the future of Blake reception. Because again, as I was saying before, I wish that the sort of more people had access to more writings by Blake in more digestible and manageable forms. That we didn't have to have a 1,200-page complete collected Blake.
Stuart, I'll have to get your address off you, and I'll send you a copy of my Blake Reader, which was done in the style of a sort of punk fanzine, which was and it wasn't 1,200 pages either.
No, exactly. I mean, it's that kind of stuff. Like we need to get Blake out of the library and into the streets. And I think that'd be great for culture, and it'd be great for Blake.
Stuart, it's been such a pleasure talking to you, and I've learned so much from not just this talk, but especially in combination with reading quite a few things by you this week. The essay you did on religion and the Acéphale book, but principally your book on Bataille and the critical lives theory, and it really just opened up whole areas of Bataille for me, and to see the connection and the development, and make it much more likely that I'm now going to go away and read those things. So I've now got a basis on which to absorb them. But, I'm retired, and when I set up this blog on retiring, it was very much what I had in mind was a sort of gamble that I would pursue these intuitions I had about surrealism, radical theology and politics together, and with these specific things about Castoriadis and Bataille in particular. And I think you've really taken me to the next level with thinking about Bataille. So I'm hoping that when I've gone away and done that reading of more and thought more about it, that I maybe even get you back on the program to talk, to take it to the next level. Because I think the Blake Bataille thing is turning out to be as interesting to me as the Castoriadis thing about the imagination and politics. So once again, thank you. And thank you to everyone else who's been tuned in, as they say. No, you don't tune in anymore, do you? You click through. But thank you, everyone, for joining us. I will say, as I always do, that however you came across the podcast, because it's widely syndicated on all sorts of platforms, please come and find its home, which is at Substack. And you can do that by searching for Traveller in the Evening, one word, .com. And the reason it's worth doing that is, first, because it gives you an opportunity to subscribe to my Substack. But secondly, the podcast itself will be supported by, an essay and materials and visual materials and some maybe reading list, I don't know, various bits and pieces of supporting thing that I think many people might find really, really useful, as well as links to the Blake Society talk, which is still online. So I'll put that up there and a few other things. So I do encourage people to come over to travellerintheevening.com on Substack and follow through if you're interested on this discussion. And I will say the blog has been very quiet for a little while now, and not because I've been bored or anything, but I've been thinking about a few blog posts that were coming out, this one to talk about Bataille and Surrealism, but also a major thing I'm beginning to write about Breton and magic art, to connect back to what we were talking about earlier, because there's a fantastic new book with his writings on magic art and many other bits and pieces and commentary and essays and support that's just come out on Fulga Press, that's it, who does tremendous work. So I've been thinking about that, and so all of these things are in development, as well as a piece I want to do on David Bowie and early Ziggy Stardust and all sorts of things. So I promise if you think we've been quiet at the blog, things are still happening behind the scenes, and you'll be hearing more soon. So thank you to everybody, but especially to Stuart for his deep, deep knowledge of Bataille. And thanks to everyone else for joining us. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.